what do I do if I see a lion, if I see hyenas? And they said, whatever you do, don't run. That's the first rule. And the second rule is whatever you do, don't run. And I knew about rule 11 or 12 is not whatever you do, don't run. And it's because food runs.
My guest today is Peter Allison. Peter is a safari guide turned author, best known for his book, Whatever You Do, Don't Run, based on his experiences guiding in Botswana's Okavango Delta. Peter is a friend and associate of my son, Nick, who, along with his wife, Ashley, built and leads one of the leading safari companies in the U.S., Your Private Africa. I've come to know and be friends with Peter over the years and knew he would be a great Zero to Proof guest because of what he has achieved, his remarkable skills as a storyteller, how he lives his life with passion every day, along with his humility and incredible sense of humor. In this conversation, we talk about the moments that shaped his path, why curiosity has to outweigh fear, what it means to show up, and how he eventually found his voice by letting go of who he thought he was supposed to be. We also get into what Peter calls imposter syndrome, risk-taking, and the reality that most meaningful paths don't feel clear or safe when you're in them. Please welcome Peter Allison.
Let's, so kind of go back to 19-year-old Peter. Tell us a little bit about, your journey, and then we'll kind of go through the journey that you had. And then, one of the things is when were those moments that kind of made you wonder about changing your professional arc, not the work that you did, but kind of the why and the, for whom. And then, and that's what, we're calling this a Zero to Proof. You get to a moment when, you're ready to make a shift. But let's start with, you have a remarkably interesting story along with 3 books, which we will list so people can learn more about Peter. But anyway, so start there.
I always need to start 2 years earlier than that. When I was 17, I just spent a year in Japan, and I came back, and after time in 1990s Japan, they were king of the world at that point. I saw the work, the lifestyle that they had to undertake to achieve that. And even then, I was going to school 6 days a week over there, and I came back, and straight away I left home, I left school. I thought, I want no part of that. I didn't know what I wanted. And I think it's insane that we ask teenagers to determine what they're going to be for the rest of their life. They're not allowed to drive, drink, vote, whatever it might be, but figure out if you're going to be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, whatever else. And I got a job working on harbor cruises in Sydney, and I was the lowest rung. I throw ropes to tie up the ship, clean the toilets at the end of the cruise. Nothing glamorous about it whatsoever, apart from the setting. And then I became a waiter, and then head waiter, then I was barman, then I was head barman. And a week before I was about to turn 19, I got promoted to the manager on board. And I thought, oh, fantastic. I'm at the top, and there's 51 years till I retire. So I quit. I realized that wasn't my future. I'd been spinning wheels, and I still didn't know what I wanted to do. But I thought, I'm going to study law, because if I can't be happy, I might as well be rich. And I didn't think I quite cut it for medicine. And but before that, Japan had given me the travel itch. So I thought, I want to go somewhere that really interests me and challenges me. And I tossed a coin between Africa and South America. I didn't want to do what everybody else did and just come and work in a bar in England for a year. I didn't see any value in that. Just pretty much what I'd been doing, just more miserable. And Africa came up heads. And, I've been a safari guide. I've had all sorts of different adventures. I spent a month in Bolivia tied to a puma, lived with a tribe most famous for killing outsiders. And yet I only feel like being brave twice in my life. And the first time was getting on that plane to Africa. And it's something when people ask me what advice can I give them, as the older you get, the more often that gets asked of you, is feed your curiosity until it's stronger than your fear. Like really stoke the fires of that. And that's what's driven me forward. I am not a brave person. I have spent most of my life suppressing my whimpers.
My guess is that's true for most humans. They just don't want to admit it.
I think you reach an age where you care less about how people perceive you with regards to your bravery, the stereotype of what bravery should look like anyway. So I arrived, and I was backpacking around, and to cut it short, I ended up getting a job as running the bar in a safari camp. I was hitchhiking, we got a lift. I met the owners, happened to be there rebuilding it. I made some suggestions for rebuilding their bar. And then they offered me the job, and I was making the equivalent of about $30 US a month, and yet having the time of my life. I was a 19-year-old who loved animals. I was surrounded by warthogs and antelopes, and I get to go out on drives and see lions and elephants, and nothing could have been more exciting, more fulfilling. But I didn't really think that was my career. And ultimately, I did become a safari guide there, mainly because a bunch of people fell over, not because I had any aptitude for it. And again, a piece of advice I give young people is there's a saying, history's made by those who show up. Similarly, employment is available to the person at the door or in the office. Never send your CV. Hand it over. If you're really passionate about a job, you fly halfway around the world. You get the resources to do it. And then you hand that CV over and they say, thanks, we're not hiring. You say, okay, I'm going to check in again soon. And you come back the next day. And unless they actually call the police on you, turn up every single day because there will be a crisis point. They need somebody. And it might not be the job you're after, but you're through that door. And so, but after a while working in South Africa, where I got my start, I kept hearing whispers of this extraordinary place, Botswana and the Okavango Delta. And everybody would say it's wild. And I thought I was living in the wild. So what do you mean this isn't wild? Look, there's a warthog grazing on the lawn over there. And so eventually I bit the bullet. And again, with far more fear than anything else. And I went and asked for a job in Botswana from the biggest safari company there. And my job interview was I was told to drive a car from Johannesburg, which I'd never been to Botswana, to the Okavango, which I'd never been to. And I'd only recently learned to drive and I wasn't particularly good at it. And when I arrived, and of course I said yes, I wanted the job. And when I arrived, it wasn't a car. It was a game drive vehicle. And for those who've not been on safari, in East Africa, you'd get a van and that'd be pretty simple. This was a 4x4 chopped laterally in half. Nothing from kind of the window sills up, no windscreen. Didn't even have a canopy. So imagine if a car was made into a convertible by the guy from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Just fairly brutalist. And I had to drive that. I had to drive it through a border, say, yes, I'm here as a tourist. Because I didn't have a work permit. Get to Maui. I got thrown in the deep end, but the deep end's the best place to learn to swim. That's what I was doing was just learning on the fly. And I was absolutely petrified, but certainly challenged and stimulated the entire time. I did for a while. I did also drown 4 vehicles,
and so keep going. I mean, because you will also at some point get to the second brave moment in your life. But there's a story arc here of how there's some really great wisdom pearls in here that, I think resonate for me, where your curiosity overwhelms your fear and, the just show up, but, you kept going. I mean, that's, and for those, we have links to Peter's books. If you want to learn more about Peter's life, then we're going to get into here. There's some unbelievably fascinating stories and nuggets and wisdom. And, I love every time I talk with you, but I also love your book. So, but keep going. Yeah.
So during that whole stage, and I was doing well professionally, I was getting good reports. The people I was taking out on safari were coming back saying they'd enjoyed it. And I think it was the first time in my life I'd felt I was actually good at something. I'd never been particularly confident and I was enjoying it and I felt like I was doing well, but I still had this nagging imposter syndrome. I think if you've never had imposter syndrome, you've probably never challenged yourself enough.
Yeah.
So you need at some point to look around the room. And I think I've said this to you before, Anthony, where I had an extraordinary experience a few years ago where I was with some of the world's wealthiest individuals in Angola, which very, very few people venture to, sitting around a campfire. And I was reminded of something I was told that I'm not a card player, but I was told in poker, there's somebody, I think they're called the pigeon, and they're the worst player at the table. And if you look around the table and can't figure out who the pigeon is, it's you.
Yeah.
And I've always valued that, even though I've never played poker. But sitting around that campfire, it was a high-level conversation about the financial mechanisms that could be brought into play to convince the Angolan government to not dam the waterways that ultimately formed Okavango Delta. I was as out of my depth as I've been since I was a small child listening to grown-ups. And I was thinking, wow, this is the most high-level, intelligent conversation I think I've ever heard at a campfire. He's the dumbest person here.
Yeah.
I was like, well, okay, this is uncomfortable. It was great. And again, it's a valuable place to be every now and then, to be the dumbest person in the room, because you've got nothing but upside, the way I see it. But so I had the imposter syndrome, and eventually I became a camp manager, and I realized I was terrible at that and stopped enjoying it, because when you're a safari guide, you're the guy with the wheel and, and depending where you are, maybe a rifle, it looks pretty cool. And you go out and you find a leopard or a lion and it seems like a magic trick to the people with you. And it's skills that you pick up and hopefully get better and better at. You're learning that listening is as important as looking when you're trying to find a predator. Learning how to track, that wasn't a skill I developed in the suburbs of Sydney, but it's a fascinating and beautiful art form.
Before you go
science,
off on
whatever
that,
you
I
want to
think
call it.
one of the things, and you touched on
But
it
I
right
still-
there,
yeah.
is it's delivering an experience for your guests, which is a combination of listening to them, knowing where the animals are, and delivering an experience. And, so it's not necessarily the person who knows the most about a particular animal species. It's the person who can guide someone to, a bucket list level experience. And I think you do that remarkably well, and you do it in such a self-deprecating way. But I think that's, and in a sense, that ethos is true in lots of fields, is the ultimately, how do you deliver a remarkable experience for someone using whatever? And, you've done it in what most people would consider a very rarefied place. It was like, yes, I'm going to help you see an elephant and not get killed by an elephant.
Yeah, thank you for all that you said there. I realized that was my advantage. I could not spot as well as the people I worked with who'd grown up doing it. I couldn't track anywhere near as well as they could, but I could perhaps present information in a way that was more relatable, because equally some of these colleagues of mine, through no fault of their own, they were from a little village in Botswana. They'd never seen the ocean in their life. So they would, they couldn't quite equate that this extraordinary wetland they were in. They also didn't know how amazing the place they lived in was, because they hadn't seen much beyond it. Whereas I remained in awe of the landscape that had adopted me. And yet, despite these good reviews, I did suffer imposter syndrome, and I became a guide trainer at a very young age. Still early 20s, and probably the least qualified ever. But I realized the technicalities weren't what was missing. It was this element of connection. And what you spoke about, if I was to sit in a safari vehicle with you and we met for the first time and you said, and I asked a question that you are trained to ask if it's not innate, ask the people, is there anything they've got a real interest in? And you've told me elephants. So we find the very first elephant we get to. And I say, this is an African elephant, is the largest living land mammal. They weigh up to 6,500 tons. They're the largest ever recorded was in Angola, was 11,000 kilograms. They have a gestation of 22 months. It's information, it's facts, but it is so boring. First is to actually go quiet and let them watch the animal and have their own moment. Maybe the animal's behavior will provoke a question. But then to point out, if Lily's there to point out that the pregnancy is 22 months and what sympathy she must feel for an elephant. And she gives birth to a linebacker. It's 120 kilos, or it's a 250, 260 pounds, something like that. Fully formed, helmet and pads on. It's not an easy birth. And so it's just that, making it. And of course, I didn't even know what a linebacker was until I realized I was saying rugby player to Americans, and they weren't sure if they were big or small people. So, and that was what I started trying to teach them. And yet I felt that imposter syndrome. And then eventually I realized my next promotion would lead me to town. And I didn't want to live in a little town in Botswana, and I didn't want to live in Johannesburg. So I thought I'll go back to where I'm from if I'm going to live in a town. And again, a very steep learning curve. I'm not sure how language sensitive you are on this, but as a guide, I've been king shit of Turd Mountain. And it felt pretty high and mighty. And I got back to Sydney and I just thought, well, what job can I do here? And I'd go to an interview and I said, well, tell us about your skills. Well, I know how to stare down a charging lion. So, well, thank you, but I'm not sure that that's required here at McDonald's. And I never applied for McDonald's.
You had developed a very, very valuable skill, but not in that environment. No, but it's also super interesting because you realize something, I think, very important that a lot of people are not honest with themselves about, which is continuing to be promoted into jobs which are no longer fulfilling for you is not success. You've said this a couple times. You said it, in Sydney on the harbor cruise boat. You said it, again right here, which is you found the place where you had fit. All right. It was what you enjoyed doing. You were delivering great value for people. The things above that were going to take you away from that. If you said, hey, we'll continue to promote you and you can make more money and you could have more of this, but you're like, that's not going to make me happy. And not just make me happy. That's unfulfilling in some deep ways. So that A lot of people never notice that. So they end up getting promoted and then they're not happy. And then to some point, the imposter syndrome becomes real because you end up failing at a job you never really wanted in the first place.
If it is any sort of niche profession, you're now also shoehorned into that. Most people don't, and for many good reasons. Maybe they've got a family to support. They don't want to go back and retrain and start back down to the bottom rung of the ladder. I was at a loss as to what to do, and I worked in construction for a while, and I got some valuable skills from that. It's good knowing how to build. But then I had a nag, an internal nag, and this comes to this, the second time I was brave in my life, was my mother had been a journalist, her father a journalist. There were many writers on my mother's side of the family. I grew up in a house of books, both parents, voracious readers. And I'd always looked at it, I'm going to write a book one day from the time I was a small child. And my mother died when I was quite young. And it was a bit of fulfillment for her, I felt, be something I could do in her memory. But that was the fear. And I think many people have the dream, often involves one of the arts, but maybe it's you want to set up your own cupcake shop or whatever's macaroons, whatever it might be. This is the dream that you hold. To actually take the swing at it, I think, is a great act of bravery, or certainly it was for me, because what if you swing and miss? Because you might be feeling unfulfilled in your work or life in general. And I was there doing carpentry. And if I tried to be a writer and it didn't work out, did that mean that I was just a carpenter? Is that all that I had left? And I swung and I missed.
So you missed in the sense...
Took me a few years to recover.
What sense did you miss?
But then I swung again.
Were you not able to write a book, or were you not able, or was the book not successful? Those are not the same thing.
No, I tried to write entirely the wrong sort of book. And perhaps to feed my imposter syndrome, I tried to write not necessarily a scientific book, but a more serious than it needed to be. And it was about men and why we behave the way that we do, and using animal behavior. And I still feel the concept sound, but I was being way too technical for a guy that had left high school young. And then I think so many great thoughts occur in the shower. So again, I don't know where people had great thoughts before showers were invented. But I just remembered playing a game of strip poker with members of the British royal family in what we call a back of house in a safari camp. So not the guest rooms, not the main areas, back where the staff lived. We invited some of them back. Very rare for us to get young people. So we were excited by that. And we ended up strip poker sitting on the floor naked with a bunch of dukes and duchesses and so on. And we'd played a variety of bizarre games. And then one of them, and they all had that very aristocratic British way of speaking, as if someone super glued their teeth together. One of them looked around and said, "I say, where's Charlie?" And I've never gone stone cold sober from dead drunk to 100% sober. Not even an adrenaline dump, just a pure chill through my body. And it was just, we've lost someone. It didn't even matter that they were a royal. Who cares about that? We'd lost a guest, and he'd been gone for about 2 hours.
And you know what that means. And you know what that means where you are.
That was a moment where myself,
yes.
My thought process, it was sober enough to think it wasn't lions. If it was lions, we would have heard it because they're snarl and they're noisy eaters and they slap each other and growl. We often had leopards in the camp, but they were fairly pacifist leopards. They never, and we used to walk around a lot at night, and the staff, not the guests, and you'd sometimes just see them, and it gave you a fright every time, a bit of a jump scare. I thought if it's buffalo, we'd even hear that because they kind of bellow and tend not to take you out in one clean shot. And then I thought, I know what it probably was. It's a lioness who's just had cubs, because they split away from the pride to do it. They stash their cubs. Cubs are born tiny and blind. The opposite end of the spectrum is an elephant. Their pregnancy is 3.5 months. They can't get really heavy with babies. So they have these tiny, blind, hairless babies that they've got to hide away. And they hunt by themselves for a while. And they hunt like a leopard very stealthily, but they're much bigger, much more powerful. And I thought that would kill and keep it dead quiet. And I thought, now I know what I'm looking for. I'm looking for tracks. I'm looking for some sign of a drag mark. And it's a pretty intimidating thing to be walking around at night doing that. How that story ends, you can read the book if you want to know. But I recalled this incident, and I thought I should write that down and see if a magazine wants to buy it. And I had so much fun writing it that I thought I'll write another sort of story that I used to tell around the campfire. And I began on that. And again, during the writing of that, I was thinking, it'd be really nice. How do I make myself seem cool? Be great to be cool. And I was trying to write it where I was a cool guy, and I just couldn't figure out how to do it. It wasn't my actual experience. And then I flipped it around and said, well, here's the reality. I'd left Sydney. I'd never faced anything more savage than a Labrador or parrot in my life. I'd got parachuted into guiding just because other people were sick. I didn't even know how to drive. And what about writing the story of what happens if you make an idiot a safari guide and all of the disasters, everything that went wrong? That was so much more fun to write. And then hopefully that comes through in the books, was just learning in the deep end, coming back to that being a great place to learn. I started having fun writing it. And that book found a publisher relatively quickly by writing standards, and still selling today. And so I know not every swing at your dream is going to connect.
But that's the interesting thing there. So for everyone who's interested, again, the Peter's books are listed on our site. This one is called Whatever You Do, Don't Run. And the subtitle is In Africa Only Food Runs. And I mentioned something earlier, Peter, that I want to say now. So it's a remarkable book because your personality shines through. And what happened is, as you just described, it's the authenticness. You tried to write. The first shot was not you. And, it was kind of what you thought a book should be. And then ultimately you got to something people, just like your guidings, people could relate to deeply. And I've shared your book with a number of people. And one of them I mentioned was at the time the president of Fox Home Entertainment in Los Angeles. And he basically adopted your tagline, as he goes, look, this is going to be our basic operating model is only food runs. And the reason for it, and you talked about this earlier, is, and you might describe it again, but it's to some degree, in the face of fear, a lot of people run. In Africa, that's fatal. But it's true also a lot in life. I mean, that lesson, whether what's there is a predator or something very dangerous, or what's there is just, life, that ethos, I think, runs very deep. So, I mean, just led to, why did you pick that title? What was it? Because I thought it was brilliant.
It was one of the first things ever taught to me. And when I was still operating the bar in the camp, was just because I would typically close up. I was closing the cab down. All of the guests were in bed. The guides were going to be up at 5. They'd wander off. So I was left alone, and I'm walking by myself with a flashlight back to my room. The least experienced person, the only one who hadn't grown up in Africa, walking by himself at night, which is the thing you're told not to do. We've just expressly stated to the other foreigners, that the tourists, you can't do that, but this little idiot, we don't mind him doing it. What do I do if I see a lion, if I see hyenas? And they said, whatever you do, don't run. That's the first rule. And the second rule is, whatever you do, don't run. And only about rule 11 or 12 is not whatever you do, don't run. And it's because food runs. And if you consider a lion in its natural environment, as it walks around, it just sees everything running away from it. The only things that'll turn and face it are things like an elephant or a rhino, honey badger, because they're mental. There's something wrong with them. So, but those are all animals that rate themselves. They feel that they've got the advantage in the fight with that lion. And the lion's as aware of that, so tends to just veer around them. It won't flinch, but it will definitely change and go, I wasn't heading that way anyway. Lions got an ego on them. So if a lion is coming towards you, and particularly if it's charging, if it's running at, which is absolutely terrifying, probably the most terrifying thing you can experience. We've got this ancient memory that says, get up a tree, you fool. There's not always a tree. If it's coming at you, there's such a huge part of your psyche that's saying run. But, Usain Bolt on a flat track, greased up, and all the tech on his feet is still running about half the speed of an initial lion's charge. You just don't stand a chance against pretty much anything out there that might wish to do you ill. So running is not the option. It is, as you use the word, fatal. It's going to end really, really badly for you. And so you've got to trick yourself into it. And the good advice I was given was step towards it. Even if you make yourself fall, get that kind of instinct where a foot falls out, won't let you fall flat in your face. Put your hands in the air so you look even bigger. And then the advice I was given is roar at the lion, show the aggressiveness. And in the very few times it's happened to me, it's not a thing that happens often. The best I've managed is a fairly pathetic, it's always worked for me. They do stop, maybe because they're afraid of catching pathetic, but it does work.
But that theme is true in life, all right? It's not a lion, but the facing your fear is one of I think, the most important things on this path to overcoming fear. because the things you described in your life were those big moments are about pushing through that. And the powerful things that happened to you were for moments of pushing through fear. So you ended up going to South America after that. And there's the moment where you opted out of working for the biggest safari company. And I don't know if you did that knowing what you were going to do next, whether, you had another one of those moments when you chose to leave wilderness. So a little bit about there's the interlude in South America, but you came back to Africa. So we can sort of, yeah.
I did. I'd spent a few years in South America, and I'd written 2 books about Africa by then. I wrote one about South America pretty much while I was on the road there. When I say not about South America, it's about, again, what happens if you put an idiot in South America. And then while there, I just thought, I've always thought you don't go back because it's never the same. And it's like walking back in your old school and expecting to see your old friends there. Of course, they're not. Everything's moved on. The rooms are different. The teachers are different. It's only disappointing if you go back expecting it, your happiest places to be the same. But I felt enough time had passed I could discover what was new. And I went back to the safari industry and I ended up in sales and marketing. So traveling the world, promoting safaris to people. But then obviously going out on safari, taking these travel agents and so on trips as well. It was great. It was great to be back in the industry. It's a fun industry. It's filled with like-minded people who care about conservation. But if that company had changes of ownership, changes of leadership, and it went from that difficult transition, a small business becoming a medium-sized business, they couldn't get the transition right. Are we a nice, friendly operation or are we a more commercial operation? And they really had these absolute paroxysms. And finally, it was not a place that was a good fit for me. And I did spin wheels for it because I didn't know what to do next. But then there was an opportunity on the horizon. And so eventually I was able to jump ship. My life at that company was getting worse and worse. And I realized it was like my bad behavior when I was younger, not brave enough to break up with someone because it was too close to their birthday or Valentine's Day. There's always another reason it's bad. So I'd become absolutely horrible and then they'd break up with me. And I realized this is what companies do to their workers sometimes, is they don't want to fire them. That's difficult. Lawyers get involved. Just make their working life horrible so they quit. And it's like, oh, that's what's happening to me here. And then to their, I'm sure, relief, I did quit and they didn't kick me out. I was really annoyed by that.
Yeah, you wrote a really great post about, it was like, this is far less dramatic. It was too anticlimactic. I was hoping for something a little more, a little juicier, but out of that, you found another path in the same industry that with same personal story arc about what you were passionate about and this connection with people, but a different model. So let's try to do a little bit on that. And then I think we're going to, probably want to get another, 20 or 30 minutes sometime soon.
Yeah, so I was very fortunate. Some old friends, people who'd been mentors, friends, they'd been my bosses as well, were setting up a new company with the idea, and originally it was going to be not-for-profit. And then we borrowed the Patagonia model where they do their 1% for the planet. We upped it to 1.5% of turnover to go to conservation and community work. I set ourselves the challenge, could we expand areas for wildlife, which is difficult. And then we threw in the added curveball of while benefiting communities. And that makes it so much more challenging. And that was really attractive to me. I wanted to be a part of something where I felt it was really tangible and probably really pertinent to the title of this whole thing was, it was the first time in my life I realized I wanted to come home from work feeling like I'd put more into the world than I'd taken out.
Also magic. And the satisfaction you get from that is deeply motivating. You also managed to combine being part of that. You basically made an organizational decision. Nothing necessarily wrong with the place I'm leaving, but it was not the right fit for my mission and passion. But so you found a different home, but you also, have this other parallel thing you're doing, which is actually continuing to do guiding in addition, so that you have that thing that brought you joy and brings, the people that you take out joy. So that a lot of the premise here, and you've just given so many really just deeply valuable, you have this amazing your ability to craft metaphors is really, really good. I mean, it's one of the reasons why you're such a great story. Yeah. So you realized where you were wasn't right. you had an opportunity to be part of something which had a mission, as you said, that, you could come home feeling like you'd made a difference. But you also designed more than just that, and so talk a little bit about, the combination of
Yeah,
those two things. 'Cause I think that's also really important for people, is this, right? You didn't lose the guiding.
no, and in fact, when I'd left for a number of years, and as I said, I thought I was out of tourism altogether, and I said I went back to Australia for a while, South America for a few years. I thought my guiding was done, that I'd moved past that, and then I was convinced to just come back out. I was taking agents on trips, and they were saying, "Would you ever take our clients?" And I thought, no, probably not. But then I was convinced to come back out and start guiding again, and I realized that one thing, by my standards, is quite lucrative, but it's also, I really enjoy it. There's so much pleasure for me in having these experiences that I've often had many times. You see something different every time, but watching it through people's eyes for the first time, the challenge of making sure it's a great trip for them, and just spending time with some of these ultra high net worth people, very, very successful in their own fields. Interestingly, everyone I've ever taken on safari, they've made it themselves. They've not inherited. I don't know if there's anything in that, but it's these are people who've worked really, really hard. But what's been a fascinating insight for me, and I go back to that campfire in Angola, with these genius level people, was as we would speak about what we did, and obviously stories come up and experiences. And I realized they were envious of me and my life and the life that I'd lived. And it's when I started reframing what wealth and success look like. And it was really valuable for me. I've said to my own kids who, they just asked me, I said, "Dad, are we rich?" I thought about it for a while. We've got a secondhand car. I said, "Yeah, we're really rich." But then I had to break it down for them. Out of the 8 billion people on the world, most of them are stressed about feeding their kids. And in the developed world, there's some ridiculous proportion in the high 90% that are 1 month away from bankruptcy. So we're rich. We might not be the richest people on the street, certainly not in the town, but we're rich in the standards of the world. But then what I started realizing as I spent time with people who are truly wealthy, who could not spend all the money that they have, if they just started spending it, I don't believe there's an outlet where they could run out of cash. They envied my wealth of experiences. And that's something that cannot vanish in a stock market crash. And it's something that I get to keep. It goes with me, unfortunately. I can't hand it on. And there's certainly a balance to be struck. It's like, I will give you one of my lion charges. You can have it. I'll do it for just a few million. Good swap. 2 or 3 of my stories in the book, they become yours, and you actually get to live them.
We may be in a moment where AI and various portions of virtual reality take us there. But pause for a moment, because you're raising and answering a very, very profound question that I think almost everyone in the developed world, everyone we're talking about here asks themselves is, what's the definition of success and wealth? And for many people, it was like the thing we talked about your job, where, for many people, more is always the goal. I can never have enough money or a financial success because something might go wrong, but it's also, that becomes the North Star. And so one of the most important things, I think, for people is realizing what enough is for them on that path, because not enough is a problem. Okay. If you weren't feeding your kids, it's not a rhetorical question. But past a certain point, there are, the passion and the joy and the thing you get from the things that you love and the experiences, are the things that resonate for people. So I think it's incredibly impactful that you have all these people who've done very, very well. I don't know if envious is the right term, but are very attracted by, the life that you have had and the life you have. And oh my God, they're in and out of Angola in a very short period of time because they only have so much time. And you get to live in that choice in some of those things. And so that's a very powerful choice. How does your family feel about that? What you just said about your kids is super, super interesting here. Is, how do you think your kids interpreted that answer?
I think they got bored about 30 seconds in and just blanked out. They're under 10, yeah. But it's not a good answer, but it is true. And they're not ready to comprehend that as of yet. They just, like, can we buy a jet? And they don't even know what that really would mean or look like.
Yeah, I mean, as you learn, as you get into this, the trappings, there's a lot of baggage.
Yeah. I learned quite recently, little life lesson, never sit facing backwards in the takeoff of a private jet, because I just sat there, the seatbelt held around my waist and my arms and legs. These things don't take off like a Boeing or anything else. It's almost straight up. And I was just hanging from the belt. I must have been all red in the face. My legs and arms flapping like one of those things outside a car lot. It was just, I could see the owner of the jet just giving me a bit of a grin.
Yeah.
Man, I imagine it was a thing first time, right? I was like, yes, it is. What a privilege to talk about. Oh, I got embarrassed on a private jet. And I'm very aware. I started from a lucky position. That probably my first African lesson at 19 was to arrive, and the standard teenage Anglo-Saxon male, English speaking, so many advantages, just straight there, just the winning the lotto of birth. And then it took me about 2 weeks to realize that all these things I used to get angry about that I hadn't had, how lucky I was, just how lucky I was, and what a head start I'd been given. And there was a really itchy, horrible epiphany, because it meant if something was going wrong in my life, it was probably me that had screwed up. That finger I kept pointing outwards needed to turn around and face inwards. And I hated it. Still don't particularly like it. It'd be so much nicer just to be able to blame others.
You talked about the lotto of birth. I just recently wrote something about that, which is one of the benefits you've had is you've chose to put yourself into communities. And now what Natural Selections is doing, as you talked about trying to benefit both conservation, ecosystems and communities. That is a non-trivial combination. But what the life you've chosen has exposed you to in many places is how a large portion of the world lives. And as you just sort of talked about here, the things that you sort of take for granted and whine about, the price of eggs in the market has gone up, and I only have, the organic eggs are now more expensive than the 8 other choices of eggs. And all of these things, which when you're surrounded by them, you take for granted. And I said, look, being outside of that environment on a regular basis is almost a necessary part of not losing your compass, and you've touched on it a few times. So being grateful for how lucky you are, and also just not losing sight of that. The kinds of decisions we're talking about are, very, very first world problems here, but it's okay at the same time. It's not like there's anything wrong with you or bad about you, but exactly.
I don't feel guilty for where I was born or how I was born. I think it's valuable just to recognize you're lucky. And it's, again, if you're trying to teach that to kids, I've taken mine to Africa. Well, we lived in Africa for a long time together. And, I was hoping they would see kids who didn't have what they had playing on the streets and have moments of reflection.
They
And
may
again, just
remember
too
it
young.
later, but that's an important thing to go back, is that having that knowledge and grounding will be very valuable for them later, because, whether they're in the UK or Australia or the US, when you grow up, it's easy to get surrounded by people, as you pointed out, who see all the things around them that are the problem, because they've lost perspective. I mean, and so the other thing that you do now, and you talked about important, is how do you back in a constructive way that feels authentic, as opposed to the give $10 to stop a starving child. And I like that. That's one of the things you brought up is, is that you want to work on things that, that matter.
Yeah. And I think at the start of my career, it was just exciting and it was fun. And I cared about the world. I'd watched every David Attenborough documentary since I was a child. And I was stressed about the state of the world, but without any real idea of what I could do about it. And then guiding felt more like an adventure than like anything meaningful. So to be able then to take that and push it into something where, first of all, with anybody that comes on safari is immediately a philanthropist. They've told a government in Africa that the environment they're visiting is worth more with living animals in it. That's worth more than what BHP could give, or Rio Tinto, or some giant agribusiness, because they are after the same land that we're operating on. And so straight away you're giving, typically whoever you travel with, if you're traveling with a decent operator, they have got any number of programs and projects that they are part of. But a favorite one of mine was visiting a village. We were setting up a property. This was the closest village to us. And we went there with actually a staff member from another camp of ours. And we've done a lot with his community. And we said, Mpape, you can just explain that we actually mean what we're saying. And driving out, they said, what do you think they're going to talk about? How do we help them? And he said, it's probably lions taking their cattle, elephants raiding their crops. And we all nodded wisely. And when we sat with this community and we said, we're your new neighbors, we would like to be good neighbors. What would that look like? I had one of the high points of my career when eventually, after some muttering and amongst themselves, one of them said, first of all, thank you. You're the first white people to ever come here and ask us what we need instead of giving us something we don't.
Pause.
It was amazing. It's we got something right. We got something right. They always say Nobel Prizes aren't given for an answer; they're given for the question.
That's a good one too. I had not ever thought of that, but you're right. Yeah.
It turns out we were wrong. We asked the right question, and it turns out it was education. So we thought we were going to need to go up there and fence off their crops. It's not what they were after. Their kids were walking up to 10 Ks one way, so 6 miles one way, through an area with one of the highest concentrations of elephants on Earth. About 2 a year were getting killed just going to and from school by elephants. And so it's like, we're going to build you a school. And we went to the Botswana government. They told us to piss off. And I was like, why? We're going to do this. They said, because you'll leave and then we're going to have to pay for that and the teacher and so on. And you just start realizing this is all the road to hell and good intentions. Other people had come and done these sorts of things and then lost heart, lost money, whatever, bailed on it, made the government cynical. So it spurs creativity once you hit adversity. So well, we don't have to build them a school. All we got to do is get them to school. And to cut a long story short, we now have 3 4-wheel drive minibuses. And each day they're taking just under 200 school-age children to 2 different schools. And since we brought it in, and I'm touching wood, a little over 5 years ago, there's not been a single fatality. And if you consider a community of about 1,000 people losing 2 children a year, that's massive. And so it's been an incredible thing to be a part of. And that now means when the lions do take their cattle, they trust us. They trust us to get them compensated. They trust us to move the lion if that's what needs doing. There's not the retaliatory killings. Whereas those buses are called the Elephant Express. And it's been just such an amazing thing. We creative thinking, positive for people, positive for wildlife. And that's the kind of thing where you think, I don't mind having to deal with some angry emails or
if I get some of those
insane requests.
The other thing
we're getting to do that at the same time.
Something that I have felt for a while is if you believe conservation is important and you believe that helping communities grow is important, you cannot rely on philanthropy alone. You cannot rely on governments alone. There needs to be a way in which commercial engagement, businesses can help be a contribution. Because the problem with philanthropy is the same problem you said about people leaving. It's like, I'm sorry, the donor had a bad year and they can't. And so it's gone. Whereas sustaining, it's, one of the positive things, whatever people want to say about capitalism, you described some really interesting things the business you're in is a very positive net contributor in a bunch of ways. Number one, the people that come there, part of the money goes to conservation and communities and helping fund the government. Also one of the reasons why it's expensive, but that wouldn't happen. And as you said, if that doesn't happen, that source of revenue has to be replaced by something else. It could be poaching, it could be mining, it could be, so it's a net positive. Mm-hmm. The other thing is you're introducing people to something that makes it real for them. Helping to protect honey badgers, helping to protect endangered species is, you can watch all the David Attenborough, Nat Geo, specials you want. It's not the same. And so I have found almost everyone who ends up going into the bush, going on safari, comes away impacted by it. Not everyone, but comes away with a sense it's one of the things about, although it's a segue, why zoos are important. Because the number of people who get to go on safari, just given everything, is always going to be a tiny percentage of the population, but they get an experience. And the next drop down of that is a zoo. And one of the reasons I was on the board of the Seattle Zoo for 8 years. it's so important for people to be actually see these animals. And so, so that you're also giving people, you're touching people in the way you described. And then the third thing you're doing is more and more, it's become foundational for all the safari companies to do what you just described, which is how do we give back, above and beyond the conservation fees? How do we become good neighbors? Because if you're not good neighbors, you'll lose your concession. So the safari industry, I think, is one of those that it's fascinating because it's kind of a win-win-win all the way around. And you might want to talk about on the last thing some of the kinds of epiphanies people have had and people you've stayed in touch with, because that's the other thing is, I'm guessing you've made connections and relationships. I mean, that's how we met indirectly, through my son, Nick, is the relationships you've had that have come out of this. Because these are all people you would have met professionally, but carry on in a sense of, friends. So just, you talk a little bit about how that's, how your life has evolved with this as your kind of business/life.
Well, I mean, a classic. I've got one regular client, and he's a very wealthy and powerful man from Southeast Asia. And I've taken his family on many safaris. And once I was in the capital city of the country, I'm going to try not to mention it because it very obviously was. I wanted to go out and look for birds. I became a bird watcher as part of my guiding, and it's something you can do anywhere. And it tends to take you to green places. I travel about half the year. So this was the one place, it was like a last remnant patch of rainforest in this very developed city. And I got up there and the place was kind of derelict. And then there's still trees and there were still birds, but it was grotty and really run down. And that night I had dinner with the family. I was asked where I'd been and I told them. And he said, "Oh, I think I own that." And I just turned to him and it wasn't a prepared reaction. I said, "Fix it." And his wife always cracks up because he's got something like 50,000 employees, operates in I don't know how many countries. And she says nobody talks to him like that. I don't know, it's like late onset Tourette's. Every now and then something blurts out of me. Not a real condition, but I am claiming it. I'm going to pretend it's real. And about 2 years later, he just sent me a WhatsApp. It's just 2 words, fixed it. And apparently he's rehabilitated it. There's been tree planting going on. It's now the lush haven that it should be. And there's a commercial reason for that. He's involved in water, and that does help clean up the water. But on the other hand, he did it. But then the real epiphany for me was his wife was carrying a bag, and it was for a pangolin rescue center. I said, "Oh, well, that's great. Is that where you're from?" He says, "Yeah, we fund that now." And I could see her husband looking uncomfortable. He really didn't want me to know the effect that these safaris had been having on him. And he's been quietly funding the rescue of pangolins across his entire country for a few years now. And it's like,
No, but
oh, there we go. If that's
that
my
is exactly
impact.
right. And I
Or,
think
yeah,
the joy the joy and the impact, from that. So you have found you can be with those people because you're not seeking anything from them. Because I think the other thing that that people in that situation, and even much further down, is many people that come into their lives are transactionally looking for something. And so the zero to
Yes.
prove is
Yes,
also a
absolutely.
version of my relationship with you is not transactional. I'm not looking for something from you. And that I think is I find that in common with lots of people who've got to the place, some version of the thing we're talking about here is you no longer look at other people in the sense of what can they do for you, but some version of what can you do for them.
I think you've got to be content on a few levels of your life to reach that. And of course, I would like more money. We spoke. Every person probably would. The richest people on earth strive to be richer because everybody would like a little bit more money. But that's not the way to go about getting it. And I do want something from each relationship I'm in, but it's not money.
Yeah.
I want good company. I want to learn. I like being around people like yourself, where I've learned something every time we've had a conversation. And if you can learn while laughing, better yet. And in a great environment, take me
Yeah.
somewhere interesting. I'll do the same for you. And I think
Yeah.
that's a fair transaction. I used to have a housemate who was in banking. We used to joke about him that he thought in binary terms. And I was much younger back then. I was in his late 20s. He once said to me, I was in a tail end of a relationship. And he said, "If I came today and asked you for $20, you'd give it to me. If I came tomorrow and asked for another 20, you'd probably hand it over, but with a bit of a question mark. On day 3, you'd say, what's this for? When am I getting my other money back? And he said, because we're protective of our money and you've got to have a reason why you keep giving out. He said, we're not like that with our emotions. He said, most people, they feel they're in a relationship and they've invested and invested and invested. And then they just think, well, I've put in so much, I can't pull out now. But you wouldn't do that with your money. You wouldn't keep just feeding the machine dollar bills, even though you've never got anything back. But you'll do that with your emotions. And he said it, and it was just that, oh, I really want you to be wrong on this, but I cannot find a single count. And as I've got older, I thought, no, he was 100%. He was very wise for a young man. And yeah, so I feel if I was the person there, I was the one taking the money.
Yep.
Obviously, that person's going to walk away.
That's true. That's a great way. That's a great way to end this. Well, look, Peter, thank you so much. I always enjoy our time together. Yeah, I mean, you're inspirational in a lot of ways. You're always entertaining, and so we'll link some information about Peter if you want to. You have to read at least one of his books. Anybody who listens to this has to go and read at least one of his books. But thank you. You're, like I said, always an inspiration. And take care.
Thanks for having me on.